Hi book lovers, we need to talk about this book. I didn't want to read this book. I was staying away from this book. It's not the kind of thing I would normally read anyway, but it's everywhere. It feels like you can't avoid it. It's at the top of the bestseller charts. The movie came out a few days ago. Everyone seems to be talking about it. All of my friends have either read it or seen it. It's all over my social media feeds. So I thought I would give my opinion on this book as a domestic violence survivor, because I know that's what this book is about, and because that is the topic that seems to be generating a lot of controversy, is whether this book is realistic, whether this book is problematic, the kind of ethical questions that the book raises. I want to start this by making it clear I haven't read any of the Colleen Hoover books. I know she comes in for a lot of flack, especially on BookTube. I know people seem to either love her or hate her. I know there have been a lot of questions raised about how problematic some of her books are in terms of the content. I've seen reviews saying that she romanticizes abuse or abusive situations. I can't speak to any of her other books. I've never read them. I couldn't even tell you what they're about. This isn't any kind of slight on Colleen Hoover. They're just not the sort of things I would normally pick up. But this one, as I said, was pretty hard to avoid. Now, I read a lot of spoilers and watched a lot of reviews before I picked this up because I was aware that it could be triggering, it could be upsetting. And so I wanted to know, firstly, was it even worth any potential distress of me reading it and what to expect if I did decide to read it. The first thing I want to say about this book, where is the trigger warning? I know some people don't like trigger warnings. I know they can be controversial in some circles. I'm not sure why. I think certainly when it comes to topics like this, which are sensitive topics to anyone, but particularly to people who may have experienced these things, trauma responses are no joke. PTSD is no joke. And the problem with this sort of book is it looks like a romance. The trailer to the film, I know that you see the guy Justin throwing some things. Right, his name's Ryle in the book. I know you see him throwing some things. You can tell that there's kind of problematic things going on, but it doesn't make it explicit that this is about an abusive relationship. You know, you don't know why he's throwing something, whether it's at her or not. And if you haven't read anything about the book, if you haven't read any of the reviews of the movie, you would go into it thinking it's potentially a romantic suspense or something like that. The book itself, I've seen it quite often on romance shelves, marketed as a romance. The blurb tells you nothing about what you're in for. The first lines on the back of this edition, it ends with us is a brave and heartbreaking novel that digs its claws into you and doesn't let go. No one delivers an emotional read like Colleen Hoover. That says to me, a romance with a lot of emotion. Maybe some tough things happen to the characters. Nowhere does it say this portrays a really abusive relationship, and you might want to be careful if you're sensitive to that. There's no trigger warnings in the front of the book. There's nothing to kind of warn you. It just goes kind of straight in, part one, boom. So I think that is problematic. Even though I've done a lot of research on the storyline, nothing that I read had prepared me for just how graphic one particular scene was and how much that was going to upset me for my own personal reasons. So I feel like if any book needs a trigger warning, it's this one. The way the author writes, it's set up as if this is going to be a very romantic plot. There are steamy scenes. You see the main character, Lily Blossom Bloom, who runs a florist. I'm not going to get into that, except for that I will say that kind of name kind of makes you think, again, that you're gearing up for a light-hearted romance, a kind of a chick flick, and it's anything but. Those kind of cutesy little details feel out of place in this book. But again, it builds it up so it's a romance. You can see that Ryle he's got a temper, there are red flags. But if you don't know, you won't know until the abuse starts to happen. And I think that's a problem. Because not only is the reader unprepared, but you're being dragged into this romance plot. You're kind of going through quite emotional scenes, steamy scenes, and given the abuse that then happens, they feel inappropriate. I will say though that it's also quite realistic. If we're supposed to be in Lily's head and seeing things through her eyes, to ignore those red flags, to have that kind of love bombing and intensity in the beginning of a relationship, and it can then suddenly turn abusive, is very realistic. If that's what the author was trying to do, it's very spot on. I felt it is real, but again, if you're not expecting it, it can be very jarring and potentially triggering. The problem with this is that Colleen Hoover herself says in her note from the author in the end of the book that this book is one that isn't purely for entertainment purposes. That she chose to fashion this story after her own mother and father's story. So she has some experience with domestic violence in her own childhood. So more power for her for trying to write this. But she does directly say that this, she says, I'll read it out. This book is different. This was not entertainment for me. It was the most grueling thing I've ever written. I wanted to write something realistic to the situation my mother was in, a situation a lot of women find themselves in. I obviously can't speak to the author's experiences or her mother's experiences. And as I said, I think she's really brave for trying to tell that story. And actually, it's an important thing to do. And there are plus points in this book, which I will mention. However, by making it clear that this is a book in which Colleen Hoover is not just trying to be entertaining, that she is trying to be realistic about the situation, she puts, I feel, a burden on herself there to be realistic, to be informative, and to not romanticize anything. Now, the abuse in this book, I don't think is romanticized. Quite the opposite. I think it's realistic, if anything, as I said, too realistic. And Lily does leave Ryle. She does leave him. She doesn't get into a relationship with the other guy who we'll come on to until about a year after her and Ryle have split, if possibly a bit longer. I think they have a baby and the baby's about a year old at the time. They split when she's pregnant. So in that sense, it's well done. Lily makes the point that she's ending the cycle of abuse because her parents were abusive. She doesn't want to carry that on for her daughter. I think that's a really important message. And in that way, I think this book could have been quite a brave and important book. But the problem for me is the aftermath of this relationship. The author says she wants to be realistic. I don't know the ins and outs, obviously, of her parents' situation. All that we get from the note at the back of the book is that they split up when Colleen, the author, was very little. And that in spite of the abuse that happened, her mother always made sure she had a relationship with her father, and that she did have a good relationship with her father in spite of the things he'd done to her mother, although obviously, of course, she had a lot of feelings around that. I just want to stress again, I do think more power to her for trying to tell this story. But from the point of view of a survivor, the way she writes the aftermath is really concerning to me. So Lily splits up with Ryle. Ryle goes away. He respects her wishes and leaves her alone for some months. This in itself, if you're trying to write a realistic story about domestic violence, now of course not everyone's situations are the same, but if we just look at the statistics, the most dangerous time for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she leaves. That's when she's likely to experience the most violence. It's when the perpetrator is likely to come after her, to stalk her, to physically harm her. When abusers unalive their partners or ex-partners, it is usually when they've left. So this is a really dangerous time. So that's just not realistic. But okay, fine. Ryle goes away. He gives her space. Then he comes back, and Lily does her best to build a co-parenting relationship with him. She makes the point that he has a legal right to see his child. Of course, I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that's true in most places in the US where this book is set. It would be true in the UK where I'm from, but it would probably be done with very strong boundaries in place. What Lily does is almost become besties with this guy. She has the guy who, and I'm going to say something quite graphic here. If you don't want spoilers or more spoilers, and if you are potentially triggered by these things, please skip ahead a few minutes. But she has this guy who knocked her unconscious, and while she was slipping in and out of consciousness, tries to rape her. She has him as her birth partner. He's like holding her hand. They even share giggly moments together while she's in labour with this child that she was pregnant with when this last horrific attack happened. Not only is this just completely unrealistic, it's dangerous. I know it's fiction, but the author has already said herself that she's trying to write a realistic book. And I just think this is so concerning. It's just the last thing that would or should be happening after this level of abuse. And to have that happen after Lily has made it such a thing that Ryle has this legal right to see his baby, you could almost be forgiven for thinking that she has no choice but to have him there at the birth. And of course that's not true. You know, you are allowed to put boundaries in place against your perpetrator. And I just find that scene, especially this kind of giggly moment that they share where they have these in-jokes that they had at the beginning of their relationship, it made me feel really uncomfortable. And I know this is a strong word. It made me almost feel as a reader kind of gaslit. Like, so first you're in Lily's head being love bombed by this guy. In spite of the red flags, she's there, she's in it, she's fully in love, she's immersed. There's literally a few pages between a steamy scene and him physically abusing her for the first time. So it's really jarring. Now that is quite realistic, as I said, but it really takes you on an emotional journey as a reader that I think it's quite difficult to prepare for, even if you do know what the book's about. And then after this really horrific attack, he's there as her birth partner, giggling with her and holding her hand. There are just so many things wrong with this. I'm not sure how to properly even articulate it. For me as a survivor, this was a horrible read. I was kind of wanting to root for the book up until that point. As I said, there were bad parts, but there were also, I thought, some plus points to it, and I could appreciate what I thought the author was trying to do. When we got to that scene, it all just fell apart for me. And this is personal preference. This is obviously subjective and based on my own experiences. I'm personally never going to read another Colleen Hoover. This just horrified me. I wouldn't want my 19-year-old daughter to read this. I just wouldn't. It then goes on. She's had the baby. There's an epilogue where it's kind of a year later. There doesn't seem to be any boundaries in place in this point in terms of she's just happily going and dropping off the baby to Ryle. They're happily co-parenting together. Again, this just isn't realistic. I don't want to just draw from my own experiences here because I obviously can't speak for all domestic violence survivors. You can look at the statistics. This is something that's been quite well studied. It's very, very hard to co-parent with an abuser. Quite often the perpetrator of abuse will almost use that process as a way to still try and control and manipulate the mother. And so it can be a really, really difficult process and almost an extension of the abuse. And it's really important to seek the proper support, the proper legal support, the proper support from social services, and to try and keep the abuser at arm's length as much as possible. And I'm not saying people can't change, they can. But you don't immediately go into this, let's be besties, co-parenting relationship with an abuser. So they were the major issues I had with this book. I thought that it showed the aftermath, the immediate aftermath, and the aftermath of having a child with an abuser. It's just such an unrealistic way. Some of it was written, it's quite easy reading in that she has quite a light-hearted reading style. It's an easy read. But because of that kind of light-hearted, as I say, in places almost chickletty feel, it just downplayed the seriousness of that situation. And that made the violence and abuse that was in the book just feel really jarring and almost not fit. It was such a weird mishmash of, in some places, a really good portrayal, and in others, just what are you doing? This is so wrong. This is so off. I did feel really triggered reading this book. But I honestly think even if I hadn't had those experiences myself, I would have been quite disturbed by the way this book is written, particularly in that sort of last third of the book. There are other things. There's the other guy, the guy that she ends up with, or that we're sort of seeing her potentially begin to end up with, is her first love, who has sex with her, I think, on her 16th birthday when he's, I believe, 19. 16 is the age of consent in the UK. I know it can vary in different states in the US and different countries. But he's been kind of cozying up to her for around a year, I think. So they met when he was 18 and she was 15. Again, this is really problematic. He's supposed to be the good guy in this. And I know that teenagers make mistakes. I think Colleen Hoover is a similar generation to me. I was a teenager in the 1990s. This stuff definitely happened, but it doesn't mean it's okay. And it certainly doesn't mean that it's romantic. And considering we're supposed to be setting up this guy, Atlas, to almost be the opposite of Ryle, good guy, the guy that's not abusive, the guy that would never hurt Lily, that's almost her hero. This isn't the best start, and it isn't written as if it's any kind of issue. It's written as if, you know, this is a great first romance, a great first experience. It feels groomy to me. Like he waits till her 16th birthday and then appears because he's moved away, and then never sees her again. And there are reasons for that. He gets beaten up by her dad. But we're given to believe that he was going back to Boston where he'd moved to, so potentially would not have seen her again for a long time anyway. So this just feels really off to me. You've got a 19-year-old, pretty much a man at that age, turning up to a girl he's known since she was underage and has sex with her on her birthday as she reaches the age of consent. And this is the good guy. Some parts of this book I feel are really well done, the parts that I mentioned, but mostly it ends up being a mess, and a really quite disturbing mess. So needless to say, I'm not reading the sequel. I don't care at this point what happens with Lily and Atlas. You know, I hope they have a great relationship. She breaks the cycle, good for them. I don't care about these characters. I don't ever want to read about them again. I won't be going to see the film, and I honestly cannot wait for the day when this whole kind of just obsession with this story dies down and it just isn't all over my social media feeds. I mean, more than 7 million copies sold. Why, people? Why? Okay, if you liked this video and you'd like to see more content from me, please like and subscribe. It really helps. I'm new to this whole booktube thing. I'm still finding my feet. So likes and subscribes do really help. And I can assure you my next video will be on a much lighter topic. So if you stayed this way with me, I know it's a difficult and distressing topic. So if you have stayed the whole way through, thank you so much for watching. And bye, book lovers. I'll see you soon.